the shadow of Mount Nebo, where eagles dare not soar, and silence holds secrets older than kingdoms. What if I told you that the moment Moses drew his final breath, the very fabric of heaven and earth shuddered? That his death wasn't an ending, but the breaking of a divine seal that had held back forces beyond human comprehension. For 3.5 millennia, these 7 terrifying events have remained buried in the sacred silence of Scripture, hidden in plain sight, waiting for eyes anointed to see beyond the veil of familiar verses into the trembling realm where prophecy becomes reality. You think you know the story of Moses' death, the gentle passing of an old prophet on a mountain, a quiet transition from one leader to another. But what Scripture reveals in the shadows of that moment will leave you breathless with holy fear. Because when Moses breathed his last, something began to unfold that no human mind could have orchestrated. 7 shocking manifestations of divine power that erupted like lightning across the spiritual landscape, each one more terrifying than the last. Each one revealing a side of God's plan that will shake you to your very core. The ground beneath Israel's feet began to tremble not with earthquake, but with the footsteps of the unseen. Ancient covenants that had slumbered for generations suddenly awakened. Rivers that had flowed for centuries prepared to bow in supernatural submission. And in the heavenly realm, armies assembled that would make earthly legions appear as dust in comparison. What you're about to discover has been sealed in prophetic mystery for thousands of years. The rabbis whispered about it in hushed tones. Early church fathers glimpsed fragments of its terrible beauty, but never before has the complete revelation been unveiled as it will be in these next moments. This isn't mere history, beloved. This is prophecy bleeding through time, because the same God who moved heaven and earth at Moses' death is moving still. The same divine patterns that shattered the natural order then are unfolding in your life right now. You've felt it, haven't you? That stirring in your spirit. That sense that something ancient is awakening. That the God of Moses is calling you into a season you cannot yet comprehend. Before we unveil these 7 terrifying revelations, I want to thank every single one of you who has supported this sacred work through Super Thanks. Your generosity is more than given, it's sowing seeds into eternity, helping these ancient mysteries reach souls who are crying out in spiritual hunger. Whether you give or simply watch with an open heart, you are part of this divine unfolding. But prepare your heart, for what you're about to witness will forever change how you see God's invisible hand moving through history. The question that will haunt you is this: if God moved with such terrifying power when Moses died, what is he preparing to unleash in your life when your old season finally breathes its last? The seal is breaking, the mystery unfolds, and you are about to step behind the veil. The mantle falls, and heaven speaks immediately. In the trembling silence where eternity meets time, where breath becomes memory and memory becomes legend. Picture this: Mount Nebo, bathed in the amber light of a dying day. The wind carries whispers of 40 years wandering, 40 years of miracles that defied the natural order. And there, on that sacred summit, Moses, the man who spoke face to face with the Almighty, whose staff had split seas and whose voice had thundered the 10 Commandments, draws his final breath. You would expect the earth to pause, wouldn't you? You would anticipate trumpets of mourning to echo across the camps below. Surely the heavens would observe a moment of reverent silence for the greatest prophet who ever walked among men. Surely God himself would pause in solemn remembrance of his faithful servant. But what happened next shatters every human expectation of how divine transitions unfold. The voice that breaks the silence. Joshua 1-2 records it with breathtaking immediacy. Moses, my servant, is dead. Now therefore, arise, go over this Jordan, you and all this people. Did you catch that? Moses, my servant, is dead. Now, therefore, arise. No funeral procession, no 7 days of weeping, no solemn gathering of elders to debate succession. The Almighty doesn't even allow the dust of Moses' departure to settle before heaven's voice cuts through the air like a sword of fire. Now, therefore, arise. Can you feel the divine urgency pulsing through those words? This isn't the gentle comfort of a sympathetic counselor. This is the voice of eternity, refusing to be bound by human grief. This is God declaring that his purposes do not pause for our processing, do not slow for our sorrow. The weight of immediate calling. Imagine being Joshua in that moment, your mentor, your spiritual father, the man who had led you through every impossible situation gone. The ache of loss still raw in your chest, your heart crying out for time to grieve. time to understand, time to prepare. And then heaven speaks. Arise. Not tomorrow, not next week, not when you feel ready. Now. The Hebrew word here is kumto, stand up, to rise, to take your position. It carries the weight of military command, the urgency of divine appointment. God wasn't making a suggestion. He was issuing a decree that would echo through history. This is where our comfortable theology often falters, beloved. We want God to be sensitive to our timelines, respectful of our emotional processes. We expect divine calling to arrive at convenient moments, when we feel equipped and emotionally stable. But the God of Moses operates by different laws entirely. The mantle that never touches ground. In the ancient Near East, when a great leader died, his mantle, his cloak of authority, would be carefully preserved, sometimes buried with him as a symbol of respect. But in this moment, something unprecedented occurs. Picture it, Moses' mantle, heavy with the scent of Sinai's smoke and Jordan's dust, slipping from shoulders that had carried the weight of a nation. But before it can fall to the earth, before it can rest in the dignity of memorial, invisible hands lift it up. The mantle of divine calling doesn't pause. It doesn't wait for committees to convene or for popular votes to be cast. In the mystical economy of heaven, one man breathes out destiny as another breathes it in. Deuteronomy 34:9 whispers the mystery. Now Joshua, the son of Nun, was full of the spirit of wisdom, for Moses had laid his hands on him. The laying on of hands in Hebrew wasn't merely ceremonial. It was a divine transference, a spiritual current passing from one vessel to another. The same anointing that had confronted Pharaoh, that had received the tablets of stone, that had interceded between God's wrath and Israel's rebellion, now rested upon Joshua's trembling shoulders. The theology of divine interruption. Here's what pierces through the sacred silence. God's grief is not our grief. His timing is not our timing. His mercy often arrives disguised as urgency. Ancient Jewish tradition tells us that Moses died at precisely the moment of sunset, on the 7th day of Adar time, symbolizing the end of one era and the immediate beginning of another. No twilight, no gradual transition, one breath in the age of Moses, the next breath in the age of Joshua. The rabbis whisper that in that moment, the Shekinah, manifest presence of God, didn't depart with Moses. It transferred. Like a flame lighting another flame, the divine presence that had dwelt with Moses found its new dwelling place in Joshua's willing heart. But here's the terrifying beauty of this moment. Joshua wasn't chosen because he was ready. He was chosen because he was yielded. The silence that speaks volumes. Notice what Scripture doesn't record. No voice from the tomb of Moses offering final encouragement. No angelic visitation to ease the transition. No gradual revelation of God's plan. Just the stark, immediate command. Arise. This divine silence teaches us something profound about the nature of calling. God doesn't always provide emotional comfort before he provides divine commission. Sometimes his mercy is found not in giving us time to prepare, but in refusing to let us remain in the paralysis of our own inadequacy. Isaiah 55:11 thunders across this moment. So shall my word be that goes forth from my mouth. It shall not return to me void, but it shall accomplish what I please. The word spoken through Moses didn't die with Moses. It lived, pulsing with unstoppable power, ready to be fulfilled through Joshua's obedient feet. The pattern of divine succession. This moment establishes a pattern that echoes through Scripture and into our own lives. When God removes one leader, he doesn't leave his people leaderless. When he closes one chapter, he immediately opens another. When one voice falls silent, another is raised up not by human planning, but by divine appointment. Think of Elijah and Elisha. Elisha didn't choose his calling moment. The mantle fell, and he picked it up. Think of the 12 apostles after Christ's ascension. They didn't have the luxury of extended mourning. The Holy Spirit fell at Pentecost, and they arose to turn the world upside down. The call that still echoes. As we stand at the threshold of this ancient mystery, feeling the wind of Nebo's heights, hearing the echo of heaven's immediate command, we must ask ourselves, how does this pattern touch our own lives? Has God ever pushed you forward when all you wanted was time to grieve? Have you ever felt the weight of divine calling precisely when you felt least prepared to carry it? Perhaps you're in that moment right now. A season ending, a Moses figure departing from your life, and heaven whispering arise when your heart cries out for pause. The God who spoke to Joshua speaks still. The divine urgency that refused to let Israel remain leaderless refuses to let you remain in the paralysis of your own perceived inadequacy. One man breathes out, another breathes in destiny. The mantle falls, but it never touches the ground. And somewhere in the sacred silence between grief and calling, between inadequacy and assignment, heaven speaks the same word that shattered Joshua's world and shaped his destiny: arise. But what happened next would test Joshua's newfound authority in ways that would make the parting of the Red Sea seem like child's play. For as one terrifying event gave way to another, the ground beneath Israel's feet began to tremble not with earthquake, but with the footsteps of the unseen. Comment, arise, if you've ever been chosen in your weakness, called in your grief, or commissioned when you felt least prepared. Your story of divine interruption might be the encouragement someone else desperately needs to hear. The silence that followed Moses' final breath was not empty. It was pregnant with eternity. In that sacred hush, while Israel stood stunned beneath the shadow of Mount Nebo, something ancient began to stir. Not in the camp of mourning tents, not in the whispered conversations of bewildered elders, but in the very heart of God himself. For what the people could not yet comprehend was this: the death of Moses was not the end of miracles. It was the birth of something even more terrifying. 40 years of wilderness wandering were about to end in a single day. Picture it, beloved. There stands Joshua, no longer the young warrior who once carried Moses' sandals, but a man weighted with the impossible. Before him stretches the Jordan River, not the gentle stream of summer months, but a raging torrent swollen with spring floods. Behind him, 600,000 souls look to him for answers he doesn't possess. And somewhere in the distance, across those churning waters, lies the promised land so close they can almost taste its milk and honey, yet separated by an impossible barrier of rushing death. But God was about to write his signature across the waters once again. Joshua chapter 3 unfolds like a sacred scroll written in liquid lightning. The command comes not with thunder, not with burning bush or smoking mountain, but with the quiet authority that moves worlds. Take up the Ark of the Covenant and pass before the people. Can you feel the weight of that moment? The Ark, that golden repository of divine presence, the very throne room of the Almighty, condensed into acacia wood and gold. For 40 years it had dwelt in the most holy place, veiled from human eyes, approached only by the high priest on the Day of Atonement. Now it was to lead them into battle against the laws of nature itself. Here is where the story takes a turn that will haunt your dreams. Joshua gathers the people and speaks words that seem to defy reason. When you see the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord your God, and the priests carrying it, then you are to move out from your positions and follow it. But then comes the command that turns blood to ice. The priests who carry the Ark are to go and stand in the river. Stand in the river, not beside it, not near it, not on its banks where safety whispers sweet assurances, but in the very heart of the flood, where death roars its ancient song. This is where faith and madness become indistinguishable. Imagine being one of those priests. Your hands grip the golden poles that bear the weight of eternity. Your feet approach waters that could sweep away 1,000 men. Every instinct screams retreat. Every sinew trembles with terror. Yet you step forward, because sometimes obedience demands we walk into the very thing that could destroy us. And then, the impossible. The moment the precise heartbeat when priestly sandals touched the rushing waters, something happened that defied every law of physics, every principle of nature. Joshua 3:16 records it with breathtaking simplicity. The water from upstream stopped flowing. It piled up in a heap a great distance away. While the water flowing down to the Sea of the Araba was completely cut off, the Jordan didn't just slow. It didn't gradually recede. It stopped. Completely. Instantly. As if an invisible hand had seized the throat of the river and commanded silence. The raging torrent that moments before had threatened to swallow armies now stood frozen like a crystal wall, reaching toward heaven. Where chaos had reigned, now stretched a highway of dry ground, wide enough for a nation to cross. But here's the detail that will shatter your understanding of how God works. The miracle didn't happen before the priests stepped into danger. It happened because they stepped into danger. The waters didn't part to make their path safe. They parted because their path was surrendered. God had been waiting, not for their comfort, but for their courage, not for their certainty, but for their step into uncertainty. This is the terrifying beauty of divine partnership. God moves when we move, not before. Do you see what God was declaring? The same power that had split the Red Sea under Moses' rod was now splitting the Jordan under Joshua's faith. But this wasn't repetition. This was coronation. Before the eyes of 600,000 witnesses, God was placing his seal of approval upon Moses' successor. Without ceremony, without debate, without human appointment, Joshua was being confirmed by the only authority that matters, the sovereign will of the Almighty. The message thundered across both sides of eternity. God doesn't bury power with prophets, he transfers it. Moses had held the rod that commanded seas. Now Joshua held the trust that commanded rivers. The same spirit that breathed through the first leader now breathed through the second. Death had taken Moses, but death could not touch the divine mandate that flowed through him. This is why the enemies of Israel began to tremble. News of the Jordan's parting spread like wildfire across Canaan. Kings who had sharpened their swords for war suddenly found their hands shaking. Warriors who had boasted of slaughtering Hebrew slaves now whispered fearfully in palace corridors, for they understood what many modern hearts struggle to grasp. When God moves, the very foundations of reality shift. The wilderness was over. The conquest had begun. As the last sandal pressed into the promised soil and the Jordan resumed its ancient song, something had changed forever. Israel was no longer a wandering people sustained by daily miracles. They were a conquering army backed by the God who makes rivers bow. But the most terrifying revelation was yet to come. For, as Joshua gazed across the dry riverbed where waters had stood like walls just hours before, he began to understand that crossing the Jordan was not the miraculite, was merely the announcement. The real miracle, the one that would shake kingdoms and topple giants, was still approaching. And when it arrived, it would come not with the splitting of waters, but with the shattering of walls that men had deemed unbreakable. The question burns across the centuries to your heart today. Have you ever had to step before the waters moved? Because God is still looking for feet that will touch the flood before the miracle manifests. He's still seeking hearts that will choose obedience over evidence, surrender over safety, trust over terror. The same God who stopped the Jordan with priestly footsteps is waiting to move mountains with your mustard seed of faith. And the most shocking truth of all? He's been waiting for you to take that first terrifying step. In the hushed moments before dawn breaks over Jericho's towering walls, something moves in the shadows of Israel's camp. Not the stirring of warriors sharpening swords or generals mapping battle strategies. Something far more disturbing, far more sacred. Picture this. You've just witnessed the Jordan River bow in supernatural submission, its waters piling up like liquid mountains while an entire nation crosses on dry ground. The momentum is electric. Victory seems inevitable. Jericho's watchmen pace nervously on their battlements, knowing that the God who splits rivers is now at their gates. This is the moment any earthly commander would strike, swift, decisive, while fear still trembles in the enemy's bones. But then, God speaks, and what he commands will send shockwaves through every military mind, every strategic calculation, every human assumption about divine timing. Joshua 5:2 records the words that changed everything. At that time the Lord said to Joshua, "Make flint knives for yourself, and circumcise the sons of Israel again the second time." Can you hear the collective gasp that must have swept through the camp? Can you imagine the stunned silence that followed? Here they stand, poised for conquest, and God orders them to stop, to lay down their weapons, to take up surgical blades instead, not against their enemies, against themselves. What kind of God deliberately weakens his army on the eve of war? The answer cuts deeper than any flint knife, because this wasn't about military strategy, this was about covenant surgery. And before God would fight through them, he had to cut away what was unclean in them. For 40 years, an entire generation had wandered the wilderness, unmarked by the covenant sign. Joshua 5:5 reveals the haunting truth. All the people who came out had been circumcised, but all the people born in the wilderness on the way as they came out of Egypt had not been circumcised. They carried the promises, they had witnessed the miracles, they bore the name of Abraham's God, but they didn't yet bear the mark of Abraham's covenant in their flesh. And God could not give them victory while they remained spiritually incomplete. Sometimes what looks like divine delay is actually divine surgery. Imagine being one of those young warriors that morning. You've trained for this moment your entire life. You've heard the stories of your father's cowardice, how fear kept them from this very land for 4 decades. You've sworn you won't repeat their failures. Your sword is sharp, your courage is steel. Then Joshua approaches with a flint knife in his hand and covenant fire in his eyes. The physical pain was nothing compared to the spiritual truth being carved into Israel's identity. Joshua 5-9 captures the deeper meaning. Then the Lord said to Joshua, "This day I have rolled away the reproach of Egypt from you." Egypt, the house of bondage, the identity of slaves. For 4 decades, they had carried the scars of that shame. They were free, yes, but they still thought like refugees. They acted like survivors rather than inheritors. They carried themselves like escaped slaves rather than covenant sons. But circumcision changes everything. It's not just a physical mark, it's a spiritual metamorphosis. It declares, you are not who Egypt said you were. You are who God says you are. Before he could fight through them, he had to remove the slave from their souls. Now here's where it becomes truly terrifying from a military perspective. Joshua 5-8 tells us they remained in camp until they were healed. Days, possibly weeks, completely immobilized, utterly defenseless. If Jericho had attacked during those vulnerable days, it would have been a massacre. Israel's entire army lay incapacitated, healing from wounds they had inflicted upon themselves at God's command. Yet not a single enemy soldier appeared on the horizon. Why? Because when God operates, even your enemies become unwilling guardians of his timing. The same divine hand that commanded circumcision also restrained every hostile force that might have taken advantage of Israel's weakness. Psalm 76-10 whispers this mystery. Surely the wrath of man shall praise you. With the remainder of wrath you shall gird yourself. God doesn't just use your obedience. He uses your enemy's restraint. He orchestrates not only your steps, but the silence of those who would interrupt his work in you. But there's an even deeper revelation buried in this sacred surgery. The Hebrew word for circumcision, mul, carries a meaning that transcends the physical act. It means to cut around, to remove what hinders, to separate the pure from the impure. God wasn't just removing flesh. He was removing every vestige of their slave identity, every echo of Egyptian bondage, every whisper of inferiority that had kept their fathers wandering in circles for 40 years. This wasn't mutilation. This was liberation. Deuteronomy 30-6 prophesies this very transformation. And the Lord your God will circumcise your heart and the heart of your descendants, to love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, that you may live. The flint knife was cutting more than skin. It was carving away fear, shame, and the toxic identity of Egypt so that covenant identity could finally emerge. And here's what will shake you to your core. God still performs this same surgery today, not with flint knives, but with circumstances that seem to weaken you precisely when you think you should be strongest. That delay in your breakthrough, that setback when victory seemed certain, that painful stripping away of what you thought you needed most, could it be divine surgery? Because the God who circumcised Israel before Jericho is the same God who cuts away our flesh patterns before our promised land. He disables our self-reliance so his power can flow unhindered. He weakens our human strength so his supernatural strength can be revealed. 2 Corinthians 12-9 echoes this ancient pattern. My grace is sufficient for you, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. As the final bandages were removed and Israel rose from their beds of healing, something had fundamentally shifted. They were no longer wilderness wanderers carrying the shame of Egypt. They were circumcised sons bearing the mark of heaven's covenant. They were ready not because they were strong, but because they were clean. Not because they were skilled warriors, but because they were marked as God's possession. And Jericho was about to discover what happens when heaven's army finally advances. The blade that seemed to weaken them had actually prepared them for a victory no human strength could achieve. The question burns in your spirit. Could your current delay be God's divine surgery? Could he be cutting away what's unclean before he unleashes what's unstoppable? Write 2T if you're ready to be cleansed before conquest. The commander from heaven appears and says, I'm not on your side. In the gathering dusk outside Jericho's towering walls, where shadows lengthen like the fingers of eternity reaching across time itself, Joshua stands alone, the weight of an entire nation pressing upon his shoulders, the impossible fortress of Jericho looming before him like a mountain of defiance against heaven's promise. Can you imagine the thoughts racing through his mind, the tactical calculations, The desperate prayers, the crushing realization that no earthly strategy could breach those ancient stones. He lifts his eyes perhaps, seeking one final glimpse of those impenetrable walls. Perhaps crying out silently to the God who had just split the Jordan wide open. And in that moment, when human wisdom reaches its absolute end, eternity steps into time. Joshua 5:13 pulls back the veil between worlds with words that still make angels tremble. And it came to pass, when Joshua was by Jericho, that he lifted his eyes and looked, and behold, a man stood opposite him with his sword drawn in his hand. Picture it, the sun bleeding crimson across the horizon, the air thick with the tension of coming war, and suddenly, impossibly, a figure materializes from the realm of the unseen, not approaching from any earthly direction, but simply there as if the very atmosphere had crystallized into the form of a warrior. This is no ordinary soldier. The sword in his hand doesn't merely reflect dying sunlight, it burns with the fire of divine justice. His presence doesn't announce itself with trumpet fanfare, yet every fiber of Joshua's being recognizes that he stands before someone whose authority spans dimensions. And Joshua, this man who had just led millions across an impossible river, this warrior who had walked unafraid among giants, finds himself trembling, because when heaven invades earth, even the boldest hearts know their place. Joshua musters the courage that has carried him through decades of impossible moments. He steps forward, his voice cutting through the sacred silence. Are you for us, or for our adversaries? It's the question every human heart has screamed across the centuries. In our darkest battles, our most desperate hours, we cry out, God, are you on my side? Will you bless my plans? Will you fight for my cause? But the answer that comes back shatters every assumption Joshua and we have ever held about how heaven operates. Number. Not yes. Not I'm for your enemies. Simply, number. Can you feel the earth shift beneath Joshua's feet? Can you sense how that single word rewrites everything he thought he understood about God's involvement in human affairs? But as commander of the army of the Lord, I have now come. Lightning should have split the sky at those words. Thunder should have rolled across the Jordan Valley. Because in that moment, Joshua realizes he is not the commanding general of this campaign. He never was. He stands before the supreme commander of heaven's hosts, the one whom many scholars believe is none other than the pre-incarnate Christ himself, the captain of our salvation. The Word made flesh before flesh was even conceived. This figure doesn't come to enlist in Joshua's army. He comes to conscript Joshua into his. The revelation crashes over the scene like a divine tsunami. God doesn't join your battle, you join his. Think about the staggering implications of this moment. Joshua had been planning strategy, counting soldiers, measuring walls. He had been assuming that he was the architect of Israel's conquest and that God was the divine reinforcement to his human plans. But heaven operates by entirely different protocols. This isn't about Israel versus Jericho. This is about the eternal kingdom of light, demolishing the strongholds of darkness. This isn't a territorial dispute, it's a cosmic collision between the purposes of God and the rebellion of creation. Exodus 15:3 had declared it centuries before. The Lord is a man of war, the Lord is his name. And now that divine warrior stands before Joshua, sword unsheathed, eyes blazing with the fire that once consumed Sodom. The same authority that spoke galaxies into existence now focused on the walls of one defiant city. But notice what happens next. Joshua, this battle-hardened leader, doesn't argue strategy or request divine backup for his battle plans. Instead, he does something that reveals the depth of his spiritual maturity. He falls on his face, and Joshua fell on his face to the earth and worshipped and said to him, "What does my Lord say to his servant?" In that moment of complete surrender, Joshua transforms from a general trying to use God to a servant being used by God. The entire paradigm shifts from earth's agenda, seeking heaven's approval, to heaven's agenda, finding earthly cooperation. And then comes the command that changes everything. Take your sandal off your foot, for the place where you stand is holy. The same words once spoken to Moses at the burning bush. The same recognition that when the commander of heaven's armies arrives, every battlefield becomes sacred ground. Every human plan must bow. Every strategy must surrender to the wisdom that orchestrated the sunrise and set the stars in their courses. Can you see it? Joshua, barefoot in the dust, no longer the conquering hero but a trembling servant in the presence of the one who truly commands all creation. This is the terrifying beauty of encountering the living God. He doesn't come to rubber stamp our agendas or validate our spiritual ambitions. He comes to realign our entire understanding of who fights, who wins, and who receives the glory. Because when the commander of the Lord's army takes the field, victory isn't just certain needs already accomplished. The walls of Jericho didn't need to be torn down by human strength. They simply needed to collapse before divine authority. As we prepare to witness the next shocking event in Moses' aftermath, remember this moment. Remember that the same commander who stood before Joshua still stands ready to take command of every impossible situation in your life. But he doesn't come to join your battle. He comes to invite you into his. The question that echoes across the centuries and whispers into your heart right now is this: have you been trying to get God to back your plans, or have you learned to align yourself with his? If you've felt the holy fear of standing barefoot before the commander of heaven's armies, if you've learned that surrender is the path to victory, type "I surrender" in the comments below. But steel your heart, beloved, for what comes next will shake the very foundations of how you understand God's provision. The morning sun crept over the hills of Canaan like a whisper of eternity, painting the wilderness camp in golden light. But something was different, something that would shake an entire generation to its very core. Picture this moment, beloved. For 40 years, 14,600 mornings, the people of Israel had awakened to the same divine rhythm. Children stumbled from their tents, baskets in tiny hands, eyes searching the ground for heaven's breakfast. Mothers emerged with weathered vessels, their movements as natural as breathing, expecting to find the glistening white flakes scattered like pearls across the desert floor. But on this morning, the fifth shocking event that followed Moses' death unfolded in the most unexpected way, not with thunder, not with fire, but with silence. A silence so profound it felt like the universe itself had forgotten how to provide. Joshua 5:12 records it with devastating simplicity. Then the manna ceased on the day after they had eaten the produce of the land, and the children of Israel no longer had manna, but they ate the food of the land of Canaan that year. Can you feel the weight of those words? The manna ceased. 3 words that shattered the only reality an entire generation had ever known. For 4 decades, manna had been more than food. It had been their daily love letter from heaven. Proof that God remembered them in the wilderness. Evidence that the Almighty who split seas and toppled empires cared enough to feed his children every single dawn. It required no planting, no harvest, no sweat dripping from anxious brows, only simple obedience to gather what grace had provided. And now, nothing. Imagine the confusion that rippled through the camp like wildfire. Children's voices calling out in bewilderment, men frowning as they searched empty ground, women running their hands through grass that yielded nothing but dew. The whispers spreading tent by tent. There's no manna, the manna is gone. But here's what makes this moment so spiritually staggering. God didn't gradually reduce the manna. He didn't send a divine memo announcing its conclusion. One day, it was there, sustaining millions. The next day, silence. Complete, absolute, final. Why would the God of mercy do such a thing? The answer lay scattered all around them, in ways they were only beginning to understand. They had just tasted their first harvest from the promised land, figs bursting with sweetness, grapes heavy on ancient vines, grain fields rustling with abundance. The land itself was now offering them nourishment, not as desperate wanderers, but as rightful heirs. God was orchestrating a sacred transition that would echo through every generation that followed. This was no longer the season of wilderness survival. This was the dawn of inheritance, of building, of sowing and reaping, of ruling and reigning in territory that had waited centuries for their arrival. Could it be that the absence of manna was not abandonment, but graduation? For 4 decades, their faith had been exercised by simply gathering what fell from heaven's hand. But now, faith would mature into something deeper, richer, more demanding. Faith that wielded plows and planted seeds. Faith that defended harvests and built cities. Faith that transformed wanderers into warriors, refugees into royalty. This wasn't lesser faith. This was the faith of sons and daughters who had finally come home. Yet how many of them panicked that first morning? How many cried out in terror, thinking God had abandoned them, forgetting to see the loaded vines hanging within arm's reach? Isn't that precisely how we respond when God shifts our provision? When he stops sending blessing in the familiar package and calls us to trust him in new ways? Manna was for slaves. Fields are for sons. Think about it. Slaves eat what falls from their master's table, but sons inherit the land itself. Slaves gather what others provide, but heirs plant what will feed generations. The manna had sustained them through their exodus, but it could never establish them in their inheritance. Philippians 4:19 promises that God will supply all our needs according to his riches and glory. But notice it doesn't promise he'll always do it the same way. His provision might shift from morning dew to sun-warmed wheat fields, from miracles we simply collect to harvests we labor for. The theological implications pierce deep into our modern hearts. Jewish sages understood this transition as Nisach HaGalut, the end of exile consciousness. No longer would they think like displaced persons waiting for rescue. Now they would think like established people building legacy. Ancient rabbinical writings suggest that manna itself carried limitations. It sustained but never satisfied. It fed but never filled the deeper hunger for purpose, for productivity, for the joy of creating something with their own hands that would bless others. God was saying, I've carried you this far. Now I'll teach you to carry others. Can you see the tender mercy hidden in what seemed like sudden abandonment? For 40 years, God had been their provider. Now he was calling them to be his partners. The same hands that once gathered manna would now grip plow handles. The same eyes that once searched for heaven's bread would now scan horizons for enemies and opportunities. This was the terrifying beauty of spiritual maturity. God doesn't just want us dependent on his gifts. He wants us dangerous with his calling. He doesn't just want us fed. He wants us fruitful. And so the manna ceased, not because God's love had ended, but because God's purpose was just beginning. The morning when Israel woke to empty ground wasn't the day God stopped providing. It was the day he started promoting. From consumers to cultivators, from gatherers to growers, from people who simply survived to people who would thrive and multiply and fill the earth with the knowledge of his glory. But this sacred shift revealed something even more profound about the nature of divine timing. God had been preparing this moment for decades. Every step through the wilderness had been training for this transition. Every lesson in trust, every test of obedience, every miracle witnessed had been preparation for the day when they would need to believe without seeing manna at their feet. The God who once rained bread from heaven was now asking them to raise bread from earth, and both were miracles. Both required faith. Both revealed his endless provision. But beyond the fields of Canaan, beyond the immediate shock of change, this moment whispered of an even greater transition coming. One day, Jesus would stand before multitudes and declare, I am the bread of life. He who comes to me shall never hunger. The temporary manna that ceased in Joshua's day pointed to the eternal bread that would never fail. As the sun set on that first day without manna, as families gathered around tables laden with the fruit of promised land soil, something profound had shifted in the spiritual atmosphere. They were no longer just God's children, they were his heirs. No longer just his beloved, they were his partners in the great work of establishing his kingdom on earth. The manna had ceased, but the miracle was just beginning. In the trembling silence that followed Moses' death, something stirred in the heart of Israel that no prophet had dared to prophesy. Picture this moment, if you will. The greatest leader in human history has just breathed his last on Mount Nebo. For 40 years, this same generation had tested Moses at every turn. They had grumbled when the manna fell like clockwork from heaven. They had raged when water burst from rocks at his command. They had even fashioned golden calves while thunder still echoed from Sinai's peak. These were the same voices that had screamed for meat in the wilderness, forgetting that God's bread sustained them daily. The same hearts that had trembled before giants in Canaan, choosing fear over faith. The same mouths that had whispered rebellion around dying campfires, questioning whether the Almighty had truly called them out of Egypt. Moses had carried their complaints like stones in his heart. He had interceded for them when God's wrath burned white hot. He had pleaded for mercy when heaven itself grew weary of their endless murmuring. And now, Moses was gone. What would happen next? Logic suggested chaos. History predicted fragmentation. Human nature anticipated another explosion of rebellion, perhaps even a return to Egypt's familiar chains. But then something extraordinary unfolded, something so stunning it defied every pattern of their wilderness wandering. The people who had rebelled against Moses now pledged absolute loyalty to Joshua. Joshua 1:16-18 preserves their shocking declaration like sacred ink pressed into eternity. All that you command us we will do, and wherever you send us we will go. Just as we heeded Moses in all things, so we will heed you. Only may the Lord your God be with you, as he was with Moses. Whoever rebels against your command, and does not obey your words, in all that you command him, shall be put to death. Only be strong and courageous. Can you hear the thunderous weight of those words? This wasn't polite cooperation or grudging compliance. This was a blood oath, a sacred covenant sealed not with ceremony, but with the sobering threat of death for any who dared resist. But how? How did the generation that had driven Moses to the edge of despair suddenly transform into unified disciples of divine order? The answer lies buried in the graveyards of their own making. Scattered across 40 years of desert sand lay the bones of their fathers and mothers, those who had chosen doubt over faith, complaint over gratitude, rebellion over submission. Numbers 32-13 records the chilling mathematics of disobedience. So the Lord's anger was aroused against Israel, and he made them wander in the wilderness 40 years, until all the generation that had done evil in the sight of the Lord was gone. This new generation had grown up walking past the graves of consequence. They had buried parents who died clutching unfulfilled promises. They had learned to count years, not by harvests, but by funerals. They understood, in ways their predecessors never could, that rebellion against God's appointed leader was rebellion against God himself. Sometimes loyalty is born from scars. The wilderness had become their theological seminary, teaching them truths that no scroll could contain. They had witnessed firsthand the terrible cost of testing the Almighty's patience. They had seen how quickly murmuring could turn to mourning, how swiftly doubt could decay into death. But this wasn't mere fear driving their allegiance to Joshua. This was wisdom carved by suffering, understanding hewn from hard experience. They had also seen God's faithfulness threading through their darkest chapters. The same wilderness that claimed the rebellious had sustained the remnant. The same desert that buried the disobedient had birthed a generation ready for inheritance. Hebrews 3:19 captures the tragic epitaph of their parents. So we see that they could not enter in because of unbelief. But this new generation had learned to write a different story. Where their fathers had seen giants, they would see opportunities. Where their mothers had heard impossibility, they would hear invitation. The fragments were finally aligning into divine order. Notice the profound spiritual architecture of their pledge to Joshua. They didn't promise to follow him if his plans made sense. They didn't negotiate terms or demand guarantees. They declared absolute obedience with only one condition: that God's presence rest upon him as it had upon Moses. This was covenant thinking. This was understanding that human leadership, at its highest expression, is simply divine authority flowing through earthen vessels. They weren't pledging allegiance to Joshua's personality or charisma. They were submitting to the God who had chosen to work through him. Only be strong and courageous, they urged their new leader. Can you hear the poignant reversal in those words? For 40 years, Moses had spent his strength trying to make them courageous. Now they were offering their unified strength to make Joshua bold. The Hebrew word for their unity here carries the weight of military formation: soldiers locking shields, archers drawing bowstrings in perfect synchronization. What had once been a mob of complainers had crystallized into an army of the willing. But perhaps the most stunning element of their declaration was the death penalty they pronounced upon rebellion. These weren't words spoken in emotional heat. This was a generation that had calculated the true cost of divided loyalty and found it too expensive to bear again. They had learned that some bridges must be burned to prevent retreat. The graves in the wilderness had taught them that halfway obedience was whole disobedience. That conditional commitment was really rebellion wearing religious clothes. That when God moves, the only safe place is in the center of his will, following his appointed leader without reservation. And so the shadow of rebellion was finally broken, not by force, but by revelation, not by threats, but by truth. As you witness this stunning transformation, perhaps you hear echoes of your own journey. Have your wilderness seasons taught you truths that prosperity never could? Have your scars become the very foundation of your strength? Have your past rebellions been redeemed into present obedience? The God who unified a fractured nation under Joshua's leadership is still writing stories of redemption through surrendered hearts. But even as Israel stood unified on the banks of the Jordan, preparing to follow Joshua into the impossible, another shock awaited them. For the God who had just healed their hearts of rebellion was about to test their faith with waters that refused to yield until trembling feet dared to step into the flood. Have your past wounds made you more obedient today? Comment united if God has redeemed your wilderness and transformed your scars into strength. In the trembling silence before dawn, something ancient stirs. 7 days, 7 circuits, 7 priests, 7 trumpet, and one moment that would shatter the laws of physics and echo through eternity. What you're about to witness defies every military manual ever written, because the conquest of Jericho wasn't won by siege engines or battering rams. It wasn't conquered by sword or spear. The mightiest fortress in Canaan fell to something far more dangerous than any weapon forged by human hands. It fell to worship, but not the gentle, sanitized worship of Sunday morning sanctuaries. This was worship weaponized by divine precision, worship that carried the very frequency of heaven itself, worship that could crack granite and topple giants. Listen closely. Can you hear the footsteps of eternity approaching? Joshua 6 opens like the curtain rising on heaven's theater. The strategy God unveils is so outrageous, so seemingly foolish, that any earthly general would have laughed until his ribs ached. March around the city once a day for 6 days. Carry the ark. Blow trumpets. Say nothing. Then on the 7th day, march 7 times and shout. Can you picture Joshua's face when God delivered these orders? Here was a man who had studied under Moses, witnessed the parting of seas, stood before the commander of heaven's armies. Yet even Joshua must have felt his knees buckle at the sheer audacity of this divine battle plan. But hidden within this apparent madness lay a truth that would shake kingdoms. You see, Jericho wasn't just a city, it was a statement. Rising from the Jordan Valley like a clenched fist of defiance, its walls reached toward heaven in blasphemous pride. Archaeological evidence suggests these walls stood nearly 20 feet thick and 25 feet high, double fortified, impenetrable, a monument to human engineering and military might. But more than that, Jericho was cursed ground. The name itself whispers of moon worship, of ancient rites performed under starlight, to gods that demanded blood. This wasn't merely Israel's first military objective, it was their first confrontation with the spiritual principalities that ruled Canaan. And God's response? A worship service. Day 1. The sun climbs over the Jordan as Israel begins their strange procession. 7 priests step forward, each carrying a ram's horn trumpet. Behind them, warriors march in absolute silence. The Ark of the Covenant follows, carried by Levites whose faces burn with holy fire. And bringing up the rear, the entire nation of Israel moves like a river of destiny around the city's base. Can you imagine the mocking laughter that must have erupted from Jericho's walls, Canaanite soldiers pointing and jeering at this bizarre parade? Look, the mighty Israelites have brought musicians to war, but something was happening that human eyes couldn't perceive. With every footstep, every trumpet blast, every revolution around those walls, heaven's frequency was building. The very ground beneath their feet was beginning to vibrate with supernatural resonance. For in the realm of the spirit, worship is warfare. Day 2, Day 3, Day 4, the routine continues with military precision, yet spiritual reverence. Each morning the procession forms, each circuit completed in holy silence except for the haunting cry of 7 rams' horns. Each return to camp without a sword being drawn or an arrow being fired. By now, the mockery from the walls has grown nervous. What kind of army shows such discipline? What kind of people march in such perfect unity? And why? Why does the air itself seem to thicken with each passing day? Ancient Hebrew scholars whisper of something profound hidden in these 7 days. The number 7 appears over and over. 7 priests, 7 trumpets, 7 days, 7 circuits on the final day. In Hebrew mysticism, 7 represents divine completion, the marriage of heaven and earth. God wasn't just conquering a city, he was completing a cosmic symphony that began when he spoke creation into existence. Each trumpet blast was another note in this divine composition. Each silent footstep was another beat in heaven's rhythm, and Jericho's walls, for all their limestone and mortar, were about to discover they had been built in defiance of the very frequency that holds atoms together. Day 5, Day 6, the tension builds like a storm gathering over distant mountains. Inside Jericho, priests of Baal and Molech frantically perform their rituals, calling upon gods of stone and metal to strengthen their defenses. But their incantations feel hollow, their sacrifices powerless against the rising tide of holiness circling their city. Then comes the 7th day, and everything changes. The sun rises blood red over the Jordan Valley. But this morning, Israel doesn't circle once, and returned to camp. They circle twice, 3 times, 4 times. The ram's horns blast their ancient war cry with each revolution, and now even the stones beneath their feet seem to pulse with anticipation. 5 times, 6 times. The very air crackles with supernatural electricity. Birds flee the sky. Animals cower in their dens. For creation itself recognizes that the Creator is about to speak. And then, after the 7th circuit, Joshua raises his voice. Shout, for the Lord has given you the city. What happened next defies the laws of physics, yet confirms the laws of faith. 600,000 voices erupted in a unified war cry that seemed to tear the veil between dimensions. But it wasn't volume that brought down those walls. It was frequency. It was the sound of heaven's army joining Earth's army in one cosmic crescendo of worship and warfare. The ancient stones began to sing, then scream, then surrender. Chronicles tell us the walls didn't just crack or crumble. They fell down flat, as if the very earth beneath them had liquefied. In seconds, Jericho's impregnable fortress became a pile of rubble. 20 feet of limestone and mortar dissolved like sugar in rain. But here's the mystery that haunts scholars to this day. When archaeologists excavated ancient Jericho, they discovered that the walls had indeed fallen outward, creating perfect ramps for attackers to climb directly into the city. Every law of physics says that walls under siege fall inward, yet Jericho's walls fell away from the city, as if pushed by an invisible hand from within, as if heaven itself had reached down and swept them aside. The conquest that followed was swift and terrible, but it wasn't revenge, it was judgment. For centuries, the Canaanites had filled up the cup of God's wrath with child sacrifice, temple prostitution, and blasphemies too dark to name. The fall of Jericho was divine surgery, cutting away a cancer before it could spread. Yet even in judgment, mercy flickered. Rahab, the prostitute, who had hidden Israel's spies and declared faith in their God, was spared. Her scarlet cord became a banner of grace hanging from her window as destruction swept around her. For even in his wrath, God remembers mercy. But the deepest truth lies hidden in the silence. For 6 days, Israel marched without speaking. No war cries, no boasting, no threats hurled at their enemies. Just the sound of feet on earth and ram's horns crying to heaven. This wasn't just military strategy, it was spiritual discipline. Sometimes God calls us to march in silence while the world mocks. Sometimes He asks us to circle the impossible situations in our lives day after day, saying nothing, claiming nothing, simply trusting that He is building something supernatural in the realm we cannot see. Your Jericho walls are trembling even now. What fortress of impossibility stands before you today? What stronghold of disease, financial ruin, broken relationships, or spiritual barrenness seems too mighty to fall? God's strategy hasn't changed. March, worship, wait, and when He gives the signal, shout, because when worship aligns with God's timing, walls don't just crack, they collapse completely, falling outward to become the very pathway to your promised land. The ram's horns of eternity still echo across time, calling you to pick up your trumpet and join the symphony. In the deepening twilight of Mount Nebo, where the breath of eternity mingles with desert wind, something profound settles over the landscape like sacred dust. The greatest prophet who ever walked among mortals has breathed his last. His eyes, undimmed by age, have closed forever. His staff, once blazing with the fire of heaven, lies silent in the sand. Yet listen, do you hear it? That sound echoing across the valleys below is not the wail of mourning you might expect. It is something far more startling, far more beautiful, and infinitely more terrifying. It is the sound of divine purpose refusing to pause even for the death of its greatest servant. Deuteronomy 34:10 stands, like a monument carved in stone and tears. But since then, there has not arisen in Israel a prophet like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. These words carry the weight of finality, don't they? The sense that an era has ended, that something irreplaceable has been lost. Moses was unique, the only man who spoke with God as a friend, speaks with a friend, whose face blazed with glory after encounters with the Almighty, whose very presence could make nations tremble. The curtain fell on Mount Nebo, but not on the story, only on that chapter. 7 terrifying revelations, 7 divine tremors that shook the foundations of heaven and earth when Moses breathed his last. Each one a thunderclap across eternity. each one a glimpse behind the veil of what happens when God moves, without human permission, without human timeline, without human understanding. We began this journey believing we knew the story of Moses' death, a gentle passing, a quiet transition, the end of an era. But what we discovered was something far more startling, far more beautiful, and infinitely more terrifying. We witnessed the moment when the Almighty revealed that His purposes are not fragile things that shatter when giants fall. They are eternal fires that burn brighter when the winds of change attempt to extinguish them. Joshua rose, not because Moses had trained him perfectly, but because God had called him eternally. The Jordan parted not because the people deserved another miracle, but because heaven's promises never expire. The manna ceased, not because God had grown weary of providing, but because He was promoting His children from survival to inheritance. The covenant was renewed not because the old had failed, but because each generation must choose afresh whom they will serve. These 7 shocking events weren't just ancient history unfolding in desert sand. They were prophetic blueprints, divine patterns that echo through every generation, including yours. They whisper across millennia with a question that should make your soul tremble. What is God preparing to unleash when your old season finally breathes its last? Can you feel it? That stirring in the spiritual atmosphere? The sense that we are living not just in historic times, but in prophetic times? Look around you. Leaders are falling. Institutions are shaking. The familiar mantles of yesterday are being removed from shoulders that once seemed so strong, so permanent, so irreplaceable. And yet, do you hear it? That sound echoing beneath the chaos? It is the same sound that whispered across the camp of Israel when Moses died, the sound of God's purposes refusing to pause, even for the death of His greatest servants. We are witnessing the Jordan parting in our generation, rivers of impossibility bowing before the feet of those who dare to carry the ark of His presence into flooding currents. We are seeing Joshua's rising ordinary people receiving extraordinary callings, reluctant hearts suddenly blazing with divine assignment, trembling hands gripping swords they never thought they were qualified to wield. The question that haunts every honest heart is this: are you Moses, whose time is drawing to a close? Or are you Joshua, whose time is just beginning? Perhaps you've been Moses, the one who led others through wilderness seasons, who interceded when judgment threatened, who carried the weight of divine burden until your shoulders ached with the honor of it. If so, hear this: your legacy is not measured by how long you remain, but by how well you've prepared those who will come after. The staff you lay down will become the sword another lifts up. Or perhaps you are Joshua standing in the shadows of giants, feeling inadequate for the assignment that hovers just beyond your comfort zone, wondering if God could possibly use someone as ordinary as you for something as extraordinary as what He's calling you toward. If so, hear this: God's qualification has never been your perfection. It has always been your availability. Because this is the terrifying, beautiful truth that Moses' death burned into the scrolls of eternity. God's mission never pauses for our transitions. The same God who split seas and rivers still commands the impossible. The same God who fed millions with heaven's bread still provides for those who trust Him completely. The same God who appeared to Joshua as the commander of heaven's armies still fights battles too large for human strategy. And you who have watched this revelation unfold, you who have felt the stirring of something ancient awakening in your spirit, you are not an accident in this moment of history. You are positioned, prepared, and called for such a time as this. The scroll is still being written, the mission is still unfolding, and somewhere in the mystery of divine timing, your chapter is just beginning. For in the hands of God, even endings become beginnings, even death becomes birth. Even the laying down of one staff becomes the lifting up of another sword. And the fire that seemed to die with Moses, it burns again this time, perhaps in you. The silence that follows is not emptiness, it is expectancy. It is the sacred pause before divine thunder. It is the moment when eternity holds its breath, waiting to see who will say yes to the impossible, who will step into the Jordan before it parts, who will trust that the God of Moses is still the God of miracles. The story continues. And you are the next chapter.